Hello and welcome everyone. I'm here today with Florence Chee and Nagenborg, and we're going to be talking about gaming data, really thinking about this idea of digital urban twins and how they link to open data platforms and the ethics surrounding governing data. Now, let me get started. What you're seeing here is a rendering with the Unreal Games engine of Changi International Airport in Singapore. This digital twin was produced to help the builders of the airport or the airport team to be able to make the entire operations much more efficient and enhance safety and security, reduce costs on the running basis, and be able to improve the customer experience. The idea is that we here have a model of a real life entity that is fed with real data. As we're flying through here, this is obviously just a rendering. The idea is that this kind of rendering could be changed through the kinds of data inputs that come to it. The traffic could be a little bit more dense, and then there could be sensors that act in reaction to it and change how this particular urban environment is working out. The idea of digital twins is one that is getting quite a lot of traction these days. There are various different projects that are being funded, from everything of creating twins for particular objects to creating twins of the entire world. But with cities, what we want to point out is, and specifically the idea of using games engines for rendering digital twins in a somewhat real way, is anything but harmless, and is something that we really have to keep in mind in relation to thinking about governing data, but also governing AI. So let's just quickly go back on this idea of what actually makes an urban digital twin. Well, I've already talked about some of the core elements. It's supposed to be a representation of a real life entity that is fed with real-time data and in that way can update and be changed. There are various different use cases that I've already pointed to, but one of the things that we find in cities is, and that is quite interesting to observe, is that we are increasingly having cities that are quite sensor rich. They are able to measure various different things about the way that the traffic flows, about the way where buses are located, about where we are getting in and out of different public transport are some of the examples that come from the transport domain, but cities are recording more and more data. And there's various different ways of recording data that are already in use, but that might not yet be used in digital twins. One of the ways that digital twins are hyped as an important tool for governing cities is through the idea of urban planning. And as a planning tool, for example, a city might be used to have a look at what happens if a building is built one way versus another way. At one of the presentations that I've been to, kind of discussing the potential of urban digital twins and rendering these with particular games engines capabilities, one of the people pointed out that, isn't it great? Mayors won't have to look at 3 different reports that tell them of different options of going forward. They can just look at a simulation of the city and make their decision. This carries various different problems, especially in a complex situation, such as a city. But these kinds of games engine rendered digital twins are also hyped as a potential participatory planning tool. The idea that you can share the twin with the population of the city and they can see what a change might imply for them. They can engage with this digital twin, walk through it and experience its virtual city. Now, when we're looking at why these kinds of things and what is actually existing in practice, these really flash-looking renderings of cities tend to not necessarily be accessible to the public in that way yet. At the same time, cities like Utrecht here in the Netherlands, where they mostly use the Unity engine, are using this idea of 3D versions of the city because, as they state on their website, as a municipality, we can also use the platform to retrieve data, create a design that the data can be put back into the 3D platform. It allows us to immediately see what the change means for the neighborhood and the city. We might argue that this is grossly overclaiming what watching a video game rendering of the city helps you do. And if we look a little bit further on the website, we also see that the reason that these kinds of digital tools are being built is because of 3D enthusiasts that decided that these are tools that are important and good to have. And I'm not trying to say that they shouldn't be. They can be, but I think we need to be careful about how and why. And in part, here we can learn from the work that has already been done on games engines.
Now, let's have a look at game engines as such. As the name suggests, these software packages or software products are coming from the game industry, and they can be defined as, according to Jung, Hai, and Sharp, as software products that supply to developers with tools and ready-made solutions for fundamental programming tasks in creating games in virtual and digital augmented environments. End of quote. So game engines are meant to make the work of game designers easier. They allow them to lower the costs for developing games on multiple platforms, which is also an important factor here for the 3D renderings. And they have become more and more popular in different areas of everyday life. So we see them now being used in architecture, as well as in urban planning, as well as in industry. So what is important for our context as well is that there are mainly two suppliers or two developers of game engines, that is Unity and the Unreal Engine. There are a couple of other products also available, but they are quite marginal in comparison to the Unity and the Unreal Engine. So that means there is a good chance that the product, a 3D model, will be based on one of these two engines. Now, some points to consider. So game engines are great because they lower the cost of productions, but they also have some implications. So as Fran already mentioned, the use of video game engines for data visualization suggests the need of having a data visualization in the first place. Second, they come with a very specific realistic 3D rendering style. So they promote a specific aesthetic and a particular understanding of what counts as realistic. The choice of visualization tool also determines the data that you need in order to do the visualization. So it's not only that you can render almost all kind of data on these engines, but you also need additional information on the location that you would like to render. And to make things even more complicated, you might not have that data. So that either means that you have to do a lot of measurements in order to capture the missing data, or you have to make assumptions. Maybe you do both. And whatever you do, it will not be visible in the final product because the renderings will not include the data quality that is underlying the representation. Finally, we have to think about the software as a kind of a multiplier or a platform. That means that we have two default choices for renderings that are used on a global scale and will influence how cities will look like by and large all over the world. So of course you can work against the default settings. Of course you can end up with a more tailor-made solution, but the power of default is not to be underestimated in this respect. Now, coming from game studies, it's also important to understand that artifacts like game engines do shape games. Yes, they do. However, games cannot be reduced to the artifacts. Rather, we need to look at a practice of gaming, a culture of gaming, to understand and evaluate what games are. And that is also true for the use of game engines in this particular setting. So we need to understand what kind of data is being produced, for what context, and what does the administrative environment look like.
And this brings us to the idea of asking the question of what is happening in terms of censoring data. What data can actually go into the twin, and how is that also having an effect on the kinds of representations that we see? So the Changi Airport example I showed you earlier on, there's a very similar one from Wellington City that you can have a look at if you go to YouTube, where there's various different data points that are shown about where in the city the bicycles might be, for example. But if we're thinking about the need to represent data in that way, we also need to think about the fact that there is quite often what we call sensor deserts. Various particular areas of a city might have much, much more data and available data about them there than other parts of the city. This means that if we are walking and using a games engine, in principle, given the availability of particular building model information, we might be able to walk through the entire city, but in terms of the potential possible aspects, it may not necessarily be the same way across the city. And this again would not necessarily be visible in the actual digital twin. It could be. But then there's also other ways of thinking about the idea of censoring and censoring, really through this idea of sensing. How we experience the city is certainly something that might not necessarily be directly translated in the way that we are experiencing it in a digital twin. We won't be able to take in any of the smells. We won't be able to really feel the cold. And we won't be able to engage with that particular type of digital rendering of data in the same way as we would be with the city. And this can have important implications, especially when we're thinking about what kind of data might some suggest could also be built into twins.
Thank you, Fran. So now we're going into some of the should we's, in addition to the can we's of technology. And I would ask you to consider, when you are going through a city, do you experience it in 3 dimensions solely? Is our effort to render binary into understanding the inner workings of a city wholly appropriate? And these are some of the questions that, going into some of the ethical quandaries of rendering cities with game engines, we're provoking in our talk. So here's an example, given the international aspects of adopting digital twins as a mode of governance. Here's one example of how we are currently proceeding with training AIs to spot homeless encampments, for example. So part of a city is also things that we might regard as nuisances. As Fran indicated with the censoring aspects, sensing and censoring are part of governing a city. What we might regard as an unpleasant smell, as protest, as occupation. These are all parts of the whole of what makes governing a city complicated, as opposed to a lab environment where one might send sensors, drones to gather data. So San Jose's foray into automated surveillance of homelessness is one example of this type of data-driven design in the hopes of automatically detecting homeless encampments. How might we regard deviant behavior? How might we regard nuisances and things, people being not where they should be? These are some of the points in how we are training our data, or how we're using data to train machines. In terms of visual justice, how we are privileging what can be sensed, what we are coding to sense in these game engines, and feeding these game engines with massive amounts of data. How that process is perhaps unintentionally homogenizing a diverse urban landscape that renders difference invisible, while imposing a certain aesthetic on buildings and areas. What are we governing then? invisible bodies representing the user in a rendered environment. Bodies are different, but are we, again, privileging a majority of bodies and ignoring the marginalized, which in looking at ethical issues, we should really be putting more efforts into understanding the marginal and how that really encompasses much of city governance. We'll also look at optimizing and redlining and how game engines potentially lead to a false neutrality to the data. And they render visible certain things while rendering invisible other aspects, such as racism. In terms of visual justice, here is one take on how these images, graffiti in this example, might actually indicate something broader going on in a city, as you might imagine. Images shape cities, but who decides which ones survive? It's a matter of visual justice. And in this sense, the censoring and use of censors really comes into play in a very vivid way of what represents the cityscape, whose voice, whose images take on, influence the culture and take on the look and feel of a city. In terms of invisible bodies, here we have models in game worlds that may not necessarily represent certain users, and that in the process of visualizing bodies, an able-bodied person is who the city ends up being designed for, rather than who we might need to necessarily design for, such as having Braille on the sidewalk, right? Or having audio where someone might be hard of hearing. So it might be possible to adjust the perspective, such as a person using a wheelchair or pushing a baby stroller in some of these ways. However, we need to consciously make those efforts. Another example in just a game that uses a cityscape, augmented reality game, Pokemon Go. The question here is provocative. Is Pokemon Go racist? This is for having the game largely informed by maps derived from Google Maps. And how that data is initially collected does not reflect the current invisible boundaries. So the long and the short of it being, if someone who looks like they don't belong in a neighborhood ends up playing Pokemon Go and transgresses this boundary that is unjustly erected, they might then have the police called on them for simply playing a game. Right? So these are some of the issues that arise that we're not quite sure how to handle still to present day in our renderings of city environments. So key points and data for policy.
Yeah, and let me just then quickly wrap up some of the points that we've raised. Obviously, many people that are engaged in trying to develop urban digital twins don't necessarily call for the use of rendering through games engines. And they may also be very well aware of various different problems with the underlying data. Yet it is important to keep that conversation going, because what is happening at the moment is that we see a layering of algorithmic control through these various different tools that make it relatively accessible to try and produce various different renderings of cities and use them as a way of knowing the city, of predicting the city, of being able to choose one option over another, in the idea that you know what it is going to be like. So there's also various different other points that could be taken into consideration. Is it always sensible to move forward with the call for rendering digital twins through games engines, as the real-time data is extremely data and processing intensive? And we may have to really think about this question and ask ourselves if it is always about optimizing the city that is the most important way forward. Yes, on some parts, when it comes to being able to move towards urban transitions in the way that we want to, but on other parts, it might not necessarily be that particular way of optimizing it that is the most human-centric one. In any ways, the point that we're making mostly is again, what we had already started with at the beginning. The use of game engines for rendering digital twins is anything but harmless. And looking towards games theories as well as various different notions around using data, we can see that this is definitely something that requires further engagement with. Because it is really in urban institutions of governance that we are both potentially being able to reshape and that are really both potentially placed to reshape and call for legal compliance and ethical use of the data and the AI that goes into these kinds of data-driven urban governance questions. So the ethics of games can teach us there about not trying to govern monolithically through entities like the data or the AI as the thing that it is we need to govern, but to really to think further than that by understanding the complex entanglements of data and AI within globally differentiated contexts, as this is definitely one of the things that keeps on coming up, and that is that these twins are certainly not just a European phenomenon. Thank you so very much for listening to us. We look forward to taking this work further, and we look forward to discussing it with you at the conference. And here are our details, just in case you'd like to know.